Hey everybody, welcome back to another review, and this time we're talking about Iron Man, Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. with Iron Hands, which is the final trade collection of Iron Man Volume 4. I don't know if issues 33 to 35 are collected in anything. But I'm not going to review those anyway, because those are a 3-issue War Machine arc that ties into Secret Invasion. So there's really nothing for me to say there. And those are written by Christos Gage, who is a writer I like. So maybe they are worth checking out, but I'm not going to review them here. Though that said, this is basically the end of that era. After this is over, we jump right into post-Robert Downey Jr. 2008 Iron Man film with the Invincible Iron Man stuff done by Matt Fraction. So With Iron Hands is written by Stuart Moore, and you may know him from some IDW stuff. He did the New Avengers Transformers crossover, which is just an absolutely ridiculous comic. But he did that, and he's writing this. It's a 4-issue arc that goes from Iron Man number 29 through 32. This particular collection also has Iron Man Volume 3, number 36, which is the Chuck Dixon story that happened right after the end of Joe Quesada's run, and that was a fill-in right before Frank Thierry decided to do his run. I already reviewed that. It's a good story. Definitely go check it out, but it is reprinted in this in case you're wondering. So this story is basically Iron Man tackling 2 different issues at the same time that are thematically related and eventually help to resolve each other. So Tony opens this book by having this weird recollection of someone who I can only assume is Bethany Cade. The way he opens, he just says Bethany, and then he starts talking about a relationship he had and green eyes and like the fact that she was always there for him and stuff, and I could only assume it's Bethany Cade, but it's never made explicit. And so he's recollecting the stuff while he's going on a mission with his new S.H.I.E.L.D. Alpha team, which is the team that he arms with pseudo-Iron Man armor. They're going after this suspected nuclear bomb site, and they find these bombs, and they're like mini nuclear, I think he calls them like thumbnail nukes, that are scattered all over this area. And it's made through the help of Stark microtechnology, and these bombs, when they explode, give off no radiation. They're just devastating physically, and they're responsible because of a guy that Tony Stark used to work with back when he was still in munitions. This guy who lived in the state post-Cold War that thought he was going to get everything back on track after the Soviet Union collapsed, but their country turned on a tyrannical rule instead, and so he lost everything. And Tony assumed he died, but he didn't, so now he's back with these little thumbnail nukes to kind of seek retribution, revenge in some form or in some way or another. At the same time as Tony is trying to deal with this guy, a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent named Nicholas Weir, who's known as the Other Nick because he was part of S.H.I.E.L.D. during the era of Nick Fury, and he's part of Special Weapons Designs. He feels extremely neglected and inferior because Tony Stark showed up and just started giving everyone his equipment, and he took over basically the weapons division despite him just being director. And so for him to get revenge, he takes like this nanite cloud and clones a S.H.I.E.L.D. weapon system that is capable of shutting down any other weapon system. And so he takes this system, it starts to grow exponentially, and then it absorbs him into it because it requires a human element to activate its firing mechanism. And so he decides to go after Tony Stark with this giant weapon that turns off weapons. And so Tony's dealing with both of these things at once, and it's all about the ghosts of Tony's past. It's all about the fact that Tony can never escape these issues, but also because these issues are there to help define him, he should never really stay too far away from them. There's really an interesting idea being done here with the weapon cloud system that is a sentient weapon being that requires a human element to function when Tony is an extremis enhanced human, which is sort of the same situation but reversed. And so there is a little bit of a dialogue between the two, and Tony isn't able to crack through the weapon system because it has its own sentience, and that weapon system is not able to hack through Tony's extremis armor because Tony has his own sentience. And so there's a really interesting battle of wills going on there. And at the same time, there is this idea with the other guy, with the thumbnail Luke guy, about the fact that escalation of the Cold War is something that we're never really going to outgrow, that people have this belief that after a conflict on paper has resolved, suddenly things are going to get better. And so they assume the ghosts of the past are just that, they are the past, but they don't realize that they have constant and haunting effects, and they become part of the identity of anyone involved with them. And so Tony and this other guy, and basically everyone, wants to brush off this notion that things used to be one way and now we're another way, when they're really not. That for any of these people to continue living, they have to accept the things that were done to them and reappropriate them into their own identity. And this constant state of denial with where the world was and where we want the world to be, and being in conflict, is what's fueling a lot of these attitudes of resentment against Tony. And Tony has very much the same problem of always being haunted by the past. I mean, the previous story was called Haunted. And Tony is having a very tough time dealing with the fact that at the end of the day, people under his command might die. That he is ushering in a new era because now he's the futurist Tony Stark, but at the same time, that future will always be colored by the past. We can only estimate the future by things we know about the past, and to live in denial of that is both bad as a futurist and bad as a person. And that's another one of Tony's weaknesses, which is that he's not able to really face himself in the past. There's actually another great story. If you read the Mark Waid Daredevil stuff, Daredevil deals with almost exactly the same issue when you get to the second part of Mark Waid's run, where Daredevil has decided he's no longer going to be depressed. He decides he's going to fake it till he makes it, and then after he kind of gets comfortable with his life, he has to face this notion of, can he write an autobiography of himself? Can he psychologically revisit all of the trauma he's had and still come out as the same person he's turned into now? And Tony is very much afraid of the exact same thing. It's a very similar arc. The problem is, it's really forced. It's extremely forced, and the solution by the end, you don't live with either one of these villain characters long enough to really get a sense of who they are as people and what their relationship to Tony is, so you never really care about them as a trinity of protagonists. You kind of just care about everyone by virtue of plot device and a theme device. It's only 4 issues, and it has the same problem as Extremis does, which is it reads way too fast. You can clear this whole thing in half an hour if you really try. It's so interesting and so rushed and so very clearly wanting to be more that I never really quite got the chance to, and I just had to sort of condense everything. Because right after this, it has to tie into Secret Invasion, so this story isn't really allowed to take its time, because I feel like if Stuart Moore had like a 12-issue run, these 2 separate elements would have spanned the whole course of 12 issues as opposed to just 4. This, though, is all in all good. I like things about this, and I like this. I like some of these ideas here of what Tony has to deal with as a person and such, but again, part of that just comes down to the villain. And like I've complained with every story since Extremis in this is way too powerful. Tony gets hit by the Paladin's stun gun, and when he's stunned, his armor has lost all power. But now that he's got Extremis, he communicates with machinery, so we can tell it to do what he wants, regardless of the machine having the power to generate set effects. Like, I don't care if you can talk to your cell phone. If there is no signal, you're not going to get anyone. I don't understand how that's supposed to work. I don't understand how the armor losing power could in any way whatsoever allow Tony to just will the armor to do things. Like, he can maybe make it move, he can maybe make it like he can probably make it like come off of him and such, but he can't fire a repulsor. If the armor has lost power, no matter how much you tell it to hit fire, it's not going to fire. But he can because Extremis. I don't know. I don't like that. That's kind of annoying. And just more and more, Extremis continues to be something that is not handled consistently from story to story or from universe to universe. And I really wish that we'd be able to come up with some kind of like guidelines or a rule book for what Extremis is supposed to do that every writer had to get a copy of if they were thinking about writing Iron Man. Now, I did mention some of the ideas of like Tony deciding if how he wants to shape the world and such, being part of his past, but a lot of the dialogue in the story has to do with Tony being seen as a guy that walks into a place and starts to rule the world. That Tony Stark is not only the center of attention for most people, but sees himself as the center of attention. And so a guy that's got a massive inferiority complex that's generated from having a massive superiority complex, I think is endlessly fascinating. And this book adds more to discuss this notion of Tony Stark being a flawed being, but being a flawed being partly because of his self, partly because of his history, and partly because of how he's unable to have any sort of true emotional intelligence regarding his traumas and regarding his mistakes. I think a lot of that's really interesting. Ultimately, though, a little bit too short, and a lot of it is kind of forced and heavy-handed. The dialogue in places is kind of natural and fun and quippy, and then in other places it's just kind of dull expository. So this is good, this is interesting, but it's a weak follow-up to Haunted, and it's a weak follow-up to the whole of Charlie and Daniel Moff's run. It's also very weak retroactively, because this is the middle story that no one's going to care about after you've read the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff, and after this, when you start reading the Matt Fraction stuff, the two runs that people really like, and this being an average story sandwich between them, is going to really, it does very much hurt its legacy. So this is okay. I'd recommend checking it out just out of curiosity. Ultimately, though, I would just say it's not important, it's not seminal for anything, it's just kind of a filler arc. But that's Iron Man with Iron Hands. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. As far as Iron Man's concerned, I'll be back next time to talk about Iron Man The Five Nightmares, the first arc by Matt Fraction. Until then, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.